Failure is a great teacher, but if you don't know how to fail properly, how to learn from failure properly, the tuition can get really expensive. Hey leader, David Burkus here, organizational psychologist, best-selling author of 5 books on helping leaders and teams do their best work ever, including the new book, Best Team Ever, The Surprising Science of High-Performing Teams. Check out the link in the video description to learn more about that. I think you're gonna absolutely love it. But in this episode, we're gonna talk about something that's kind of hard to love, and that is failure. We're gonna talk about what happens when teams fail. Now, I believe that failure is feedback. Failures are inevitable, they are going to happen. How you respond to that failure can make the difference between whether or not you become a high performer or whether or not the team that you lead or are on can become a high-performing team. In mediocre teams, failures are usually met with a series of excuses, with a series of maneuvers that people make to rhetorically remove blame from themselves, to push it on to someone else, to cover their own hide, if you will. I'm trying to think of the most HR-friendly way to say what we all know I'm about to say. They try and find reasons they are not to blame. But what we find on high-performing teams is something totally different. What I've found in almost 2 decades of working with high-performing teams and leaders of high-performing teams is that they respond to failure by growing. They respond to failure by learning. They treat failure as a learning moment, and that helps the whole team adopt a growth mindset that pushes their performance to higher levels with every new failure. And this is not a new discovery. You know, Amy Edmondson, the Harvard Business School professor and kind of the person who coined and popularized this whole term psychological safety and showed it as one of the keys to a high-performing team. Her first study on psychological safety was actually a study about how teams responded to failure. And she was looking at a Boston hospital at the various different teams of nurses, and in particular trying to assess the leadership capacity and the leadership rating of the different charge nurses, the nurses in charge of the various teams, various wards in the hospital. And what she found was really interesting. The highest rated leaders, the ones who were rated by the teams that they led as the best leaders, also had the highest rates of reported medical errors and prescription errors on their teams. And that's really weird, right? You have a great leader, and as a result, your team is failing more. And it wasn't until she went out and started doing interviews with various different people in the hospital that she found out that when I say reported, that word reported is doing an awful lot of work. You see, what was happening was the great leaders were creating an environment where it was safe to learn from failures. It almost embraced failures. And as a result, their teams felt safe to admit their mistakes. The same rates of accidents were happening in all of the other teams. The difference is those teams feared for their jobs or feared for being blamed, etc. And so they hid their mistakes. Now, if you're thinking what I'm thinking, this is mind-bogglingly unethical for sure. But also think about what we lose in learning. The teams with the best leaders had a safety around admitting failures that allowed them to learn and get better and get better and get better over time. And that's why on all the other performance metrics, they were doing really, really well. Great teams embrace failure. And I hope at this point in the video, we've made that pretty clear. But I want to share a couple ways you can learn from failures on your team. A couple ways that whether you're a leader, whether you're an influential team member, you can reframe failure in a way that helps your team embrace it and learn a whole lot more from it. And the first way to embrace failure is through learning moments. And this is really a semantic change. This is really about how we refer to the failures that are going to happen. Again, failures are inevitable. Learning is a choice. And so when we mess up, when we lose a client, when we come in over budget, or we come in late because of some reason, do we go to the team and say, I screwed up, I failed? Or do we go to the team and say, I had a learning moment around this? And a learning moment is really specific. It's not just the failure, it's what you learned that you need to put in place next time to prevent that failure. And sometimes you might say, I have this, it's a potential learning moment, can you help me find the lesson? But that's the idea, that when we go to the team and we're admitting our failures, I mean, first of all, we should have amnesty for people that aren't constant screw-ups, right? We're not talking about gross incompetence here, but we're talking about when we go and admit our failures, we frame them as a learning moment by sharing with the team what we learned through that failure. And if we can't do that, we still take the risk, we still trust the team enough to share the learning moment and ask them to draw out what the real lesson is. And as a result, every time somebody on the team messes up, everyone on the team gets stronger. Failure is a great teacher. The tuition on personal failure can be awfully high, but if you're on a team where it's safe to talk about failures and what was learned, you can really discount that tuition. It's like a failure scholarship for the failure teacher that is so great. The second way to embrace and learn from failure are post-mortems, or sometimes called after-action reviews. And think of these as learning moments, but where a learning moment is going to be individual, a post-mortem is team-wide. Let's say we as a team, that project totally falls apart. The client goes somewhere else entirely. They don't want to do business with us anymore. There's something that we messed up on a team level that fell apart. Well, what we do in a post-mortem is we ask ourselves a series of questions designed to pull all the different learning moments out of this team-wide failure. If you're looking for a really easy format, you might want to think about 5 questions to this post-mortem or after-action review. Question 1 would be, what was the plan? What did we expect to happen? Right? Question 2 would be, what actually happened? Right? So right away, we're looking at the difference between here was the plan and here was the result. Question 3, what explains the difference between what we planned and what the result was? And question 4, what are we going to do next time to make sure that our plan leads to that proper result? And then question 5, what are we going to do the same next time to make sure that we build upon the parts of the project that did go well? So we're looking at the plan, we're looking at the result, we're looking at the difference between the two, and then we're asking ourselves as a team, what are we going to do differently? And what are we going to do the same because it actually worked? And what I love about ending on that last question is, yeah, we do the dirty work, we get into the learning moment, but every failure has some wins in it too, and we get some time to talk about what we learned through success as well. And that also sort of boosts the morale of the team. It's a great way to end on it. The real thing that we're embracing here is that as a team, we messed up, but as a team, we're committed to going through this learning moment together. And this post-mortem is not about finding who's to blame. It's about finding what we're gonna learn. And the third way to embrace failure is really for those moments where we have a team-wide failure that was outside of our control, and it's called a failure funeral. Now, I learned this from a really fun biotech company that is a research-based organization, and so they experiment with a lot of different compounds, try and find out what is gonna work, what proves like it might have some medical significance, and sometimes we find compounds that turn out to totally be useless. And sometimes you spend 18, 24 months, maybe even 3 years working on a compound only to put it to trial and go, no, there's nothing here. And that's not your fault. That's not a failure that's outside of your control. That's the type of failure that causes us to learn a bit more. And when those failures happen, that biotech company runs a failure funeral, runs a wake, runs like a ceremony, a goodbye ceremony to celebrate that project that didn't yield what we wanted it to yield, but there's not much to necessarily learn from our failures or correct in our actions. And when we do this, we're not only mourning the loss of that project, we can also talk about the wins that were a result of working on that project, the ways that project allowed us to level up our skills, and yeah, maybe even what we learned by pushing so hard in some area only to have it not work out. A failure funeral, an opportunity to mourn, but more importantly, an opportunity to reflect and celebrate the learning that came from that failure that was outside of our control. And I suppose you could do failure funerals for your individual failures as well, because sometimes things fail that are totally outside of your control. That's fine too. Whatever you choose to do, whether it's a learning moment, a post-mortem, or a failure funeral, the point here is that we're choosing to embrace failure for the lessons that it can bring to the team, instead of choosing to shove away failure and put it on someone else. And because of that extra feedback, because we as a team are getting more feedback, learning more, and improving faster than every other team, we'll find that that failure is what actually turned us into a high-performing team. Those lessons from those failures are what actually helped us do our best work ever. Oh, and one more thing. Learning from failure is clutch. I hope by the end of this video, you're convinced that it is super important. But in order to put these lessons into practice, in order to do things like learning moments or failure funerals or post-mortems, you're gonna need an awful lot of trust on your team. And so you're gonna wanna check out this video here on how to build trusting teams.